Hey, welcome to the deep dive. We've got quite a pile of sources here today. Articles, museum descriptions, research notes, all focusing on one, well, really fascinating painting, Ilya Repin's Sadko.
It really is. And it's one of those paintings that it just pulls you in. It's not just about what you see immediately. There's this whole epic Russian story behind it, insights into Repin himself when he was living abroad, and, even some surprising bits about art rules in 19th century Russia.
Yeah, so our mission today is to really unpack this specific painting. We want to explore the story it tells, the incredible world Repin created visually, get a feel for the artist, and understand what makes Sadko so interesting, maybe even a bit unusual.
Absolutely. And it all starts with this Russian epic poem, A Bylina, set in this fantastical underwater kingdom. That's the scene Repin throws us into. Okay, so the story, The Bylina, centers on Sadko. He starts out as, a pretty poor musician playing the gazli. It's a kind of Russian harp.
Okay.
But his music is apparently amazing. So good, in fact, that it actually charms the Sea Tsar.
The ruler of the underwater kingdom.
Likes his tune.
That's different.
It is. And the Tsar is so impressed, he helps Sadko out, really helps him out. Sadko becomes this super rich merchant back in Novgorod, but the Tsar isn't quite done with him.
There's always a catch, right?
You got it. Later, Sadko's out at sea trading, and bam, a huge storm hits his ships. He figures out it's the Sea Tsar wanting, some tribute. So to save his crew and, appease the Sea Tsar, Sadko has to go down to the underwater realm himself.
Okay, and that's what the painting shows. Him down there.
Pretty much the key moment. Sadko's brought before the Sea Tsar, who then gets this idea Sadko should marry one of his daughters, and the story says the Tsar has hundreds of them, maybe even 900.
Wow. Talk about options.
Exactly. And the painting captures that precise moment, Sadko having to choose a bride from this huge procession.
How on earth does he choose from hundreds?
Well, the story gives him a hint. Depending on the version, maybe a saint or the Tsar's own wife whispers some advice. They tell him, don't go for the flashy ones, the really stunning beauties up front. Wait. Choose the very last girl on the line. And her name is Chernavushka. That advice, it's kind of crucial to the whole painting.
Okay, let's zoom in on the painting itself then. When you stand in front of Sadko, you really do get sucked into this weird, sort of beautiful, maybe slightly spooky underwater place.
It's incredibly atmospheric, isn't it? And it's huge, over 3 meters tall. Repin really creates this whole distinct world, all greens and blues, very mysterious. But what's interesting is how hard he worked to make this fantasy feel, real.
Real, but it's like mermaids in an underwater palace? No.
Research. He actually went to the Berlin Oceanarium, which was pretty state-of-the-art back then, and sketched the fish and things. He traveled to Normandy to sketch sea creatures. Even checked out the Crystal Palace in London for its detailed displays. Yeah, he wanted the coral, the fish, all the marine life to look accurate. It kind of grounds the fantasy, gives it this believable texture.
So he built this imaginary world on real observation. That's cool.
Exactly. And the way it's painted adds to that feeling, too. It's like we're looking up from below a worm's eye view with the horizon line way up high. It makes the space feel vast, deep. And then you've got Sadko over on the right, kind of separate, still wearing his normal Russian fur coat and hat.
Right, which looks totally out of place underwater.
Precisely. It really emphasizes that he doesn't belong there.
And you mentioned the daughters. The sources say there's a huge variety among them.
Oh, definitely. This is where Repin kind of lets his imagination run wild. He paints them almost like they represent different nations. You see princesses dressed in various styles. Some look kind of Indian, others maybe European, all sorts of different costumes.
Like a United Nations of potential sea brides.
Something like that. And the first group, the ones right in front of Sadko, they're dripping with jewels, really ornate. Some have these very direct gazes, maybe a bit flirtatious, maybe almost predatory. They glow with this sort of magical light, these perfect-looking underwater beauties.
I read somewhere there's a specific detail about one of the main ones. Something a bit off.
Yes, good point. If you look really closely at the prominent princess in the foreground, one analysis points out she actually has this sort of snake-like fishtail. And even though she looks stunning at first glance, that detail in her expression, it's meant to feel a little unsettling, like maybe the beauty is just surface deep, cold.
Okay, so you've got this parade of dazzling, maybe slightly scary beauties. But where is Sadko actually looking?
And that is the absolute key to the whole painting, visually and symbolically. Despite this incredible lineup right in front of him, his eyes aren't on them at all. He's looking past them, towards someone else, a figure standing kind of off to the side, more in the background.
That must be Chernavushka, the one from the story.
That's her. Repin paints her as a simple Russian girl. Modest clothes, like a plain sundress, dark hair in a braid. The descriptions say she isn't conventionally beautiful like the others, maybe a bit plain, shorter, nothing flashy. But she clearly represents something else. Home, Russia, something familiar, and spiritually closer to him.
So the big question is, why does he choose her? Is it because he genuinely feels drawn to her, like Repin seems to show with his gaze? Or is he just following the instructions from the bailina?
That's the ambiguity, isn't it? Repin makes it look like a real heartfelt choice. But the story has that specific instruction. Pick the last one. So it makes you wonder, is it fate, destiny telling him what to do? Or is it his own deep down longing for home, for what's real and Russian to him that makes him look towards her?
And choosing her has massive consequences in the story, right?
Oh, absolutely huge. The bailina makes it clear. Choosing Chernavushka is his ticket back. He gets to return to the surface, back to Russia. He wakes up by a river called Chernava, sometimes even named after her, if he'd picked any of those other dazzling princesses.
He'd be stuck underwater forever.
Exactly, trapped in that beautiful but alien world. So the choice is literally life or death, in a way. Or at least choosing between his own identity and being lost forever.
Now, speaking of things that stand out in the painting, there's another detail that was apparently, pretty unusual for Russian art back then.
Ah, yes. You mean the figure in the foreground who's partially nude?
Exactly. You just didn't see that kind of thing very often in Russian paintings from that time, especially from certain artists, did you?
No, you really didn't. And that's a super important point for context. In Russia, second half of the 19th century, especially with the Parisian, the sort of realist wanderers group Repin was associated with, depictions of nudity were really rare, often seen as improper, even indecent.
Why was that? Just general attitudes?
Partly general puritanical views, yeah. But also, key patrons really influenced things. Think of someone like Pavel Tretyakov, the guy who started the Tretyakov Gallery. He came from an old believer background, very strict views. He simply wouldn't buy paintings with nudes, so artists knew this.
Did they even, study nude models much in the art schools?
Less than in Western Europe, for sure. I mean, there was academic painting, but formal classes with fully nude female models at the main Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg. They didn't officially start until much later, like 1894. Some artists did paint nudes, like Samaradsky, but he often learned that style studying abroad, say, in Italy.
So how did Repin get away with it in Sadko back in 1876?
Right, that's the crucial part. He painted Sadko while he was living in Paris. He was there on a scholarship from the Academy. And Paris, artistically, was way more liberal then. Plus, and this is key, it wasn't painted for Tretyakov or the open market. It was a direct commission for Grand Duke Alexander Alexandrovich.
The future Tsar Alexander III.
The very same. So being in Paris with that specific high-level patron gave Repin the freedom to include things like that partial nudity that probably wouldn't have blown back home.
And Repin was living in Paris when he painted this. That must have been quite an experience for him.
It definitely was. He got there in 1873. He was still young, only 29. And sources say he felt a bit cut off from his usual environment. Being abroad was clearly a big deal for him.
Did he soak up the art scene there? Paris was buzzing then, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. He actually went to the very first Impressionist exhibition. He could see their skill, the way they handled light and color was new. But he also felt, he wrote that he thought their work sometimes lacked deeper meaning compared to the kind of social realism he was interested in. Apparently, they weren't too keen on his style either.
Interesting. And did that experience being in Paris feed into Sadko somehow?
Repin himself said it did. He wrote a letter to the critic Stasov, basically saying the painting reflected how he felt personally and also maybe how he saw Russian art at the time. He saw Sadko choosing the simple Russian girl over all the exotic foreign beauties.
As a metaphor?
Kind of, yeah. Like choosing something native and authentic over these dazzling but maybe superficial foreign influences he was seeing all around him in Paris. It was like an artistic vote for staying true to your Russian roots.
But didn't he? Didn't he later change his mind about the painting? I read he wasn't very fond of it himself.
You're right. It's quite surprising given its success. Repin was famously hard on himself. Later in life, reports say he really disliked Sadko, called it things like vulgar and untalented, felt he hadn't quite pulled it off artistically.
So how was it received initially? when people first saw it?
Well, it was a bit of a mixed bag, actually. When he showed it at the Paris Salon, it didn't really make much of a splash, kind of ignored.
Back in Russia.
Completely different story. Back home, it was a big success, officially at least. It won him a large gold medal, which was a major honor. But the critics, oh boy, they were all over the place.
So.
Well, the more conservative critics, the ones who were very into Russian themes, they generally liked it better than the paintings he did of Parisian life. But even they sometimes grumbled about, the way he painted it, or if it was exactly like the folktale.
And the other side.
Yeah.
The liberals.
They were much tougher. One liberal newspaper apparently called it a tragic mistake. They felt Repin was a master of realism, like his famous Barge Haulers painting, and that delving into fantasy just wasn't his strong suit. A waste of his talent, basically.
Wow, so even with the medal, it really divided opinion in Russia.
It really did. The debate was quite sharp. But, despite all that critical noise, the painting did something very important for Repin personally. It got him the title of academician in 1876. That was a huge career boost.
And where did the painting end up?
Well, like we said, it was commissioned by Grand Duke Alexander, who became Tsar, so it started in the Alexander Palace for a while. Then, in 1897, it went to the Russian Museum, and that's where you can see it today, in the Mikhailovsky Palace in St. Petersburg. And, even though Repin was mainly known for realism, tackling this fantasy subject in Sadko kind of opened the door for other Russian artists who came after him, people like Vazketsov, Rebel, Roerich, who really dove into Russian folklore and myth.
Okay, so let's try and boil this all down. If you're thinking about Repin Sadko, what are the main things to take away from our deep dive?
Well, first, I'd say it's definitely not just a simple fairy tale picture. It's much deeper. It reflects Repin's own experiences, his feelings about being Russian while living abroad, and it shows him experimenting artistically at a really important time in his career.
And visually, you've got that amazing contrast, right, between all those flashy, maybe fake underwater princesses and the plain but sort of real and familiar Russian girl, Chernavushka. Sadko's choice becomes this powerful symbol about identity, about choosing home.
Exactly. And then there's that surprising nude figure. It really tells you a lot about the different rules, the different artistic and maybe moral climates between Russia and Western Europe in the 19th century. Shows how much things like location and who commissioned the painting could matter.
Right. And finally, even though the critics were split, and Repin himself later dissed it, Sadko was still a major milestone for him. It won him that academician title, and maybe even helped nudge Russian art towards exploring more fantasy themes. Well, that just about wraps up our deep dive into Repin's Sadko.
It's certainly a painting that gives you a lot to think about, layer upon layer.
It really does. And maybe here's a final thought for you to take away. Repin, the artist, ended up really disliking this painting, even though it won him awards and sparked intense debate among critics when it first appeared. What does that whole situation, the artist's intention, the way people reacted at the time, and how the artist felt later tell you about how we understand a single piece of art? And maybe, putting all that aside, what does Sadko mean when you look at it today?
Yeah, definitely worth looking up images online if you haven't already. Or better yet, seeing the real thing at the Russian Museum. The scale alone is something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And check out the sources if you want more on the original Biolino story or Repin's time in Paris.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
See you next time.